president of TiE South Coast, and on behalf of TiE, our 61 chapters in 17 countries, our 3,500 charter members, and over 8,000 members, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event. Thank you so much for coming. TiE is the world's largest entrepreneurship organization, and our mission is very simple: to foster entrepreneurship. The way we do that over here in San Diego, we have 4 legs to the stool of our activities. The first leg is these monthly events, and we have speakers, different speakers from different technologies every month. And we also have an opportunity for you to mingle and network and listen to talk and enjoy some good, hopefully some good Indian food. We also have educational events, and we call them TiE Institute events, 2 or 3 times a year, where the first one are eminent people and speakers who come and talk. The educational ones have more to do with how do you start a business and the nitty-gritty of that. We also have something called TiE, the Young Entrepreneurs, and I believe we're the only people who teach high school students all about entrepreneurship. And we do this over a period of 4 or 5 months, and then we have a competition, and all 61 or maybe 40 of the 61 chapters get involved in that. And it's a great opportunity for the winners to go and compete with teams from New Delhi and London and Brussels and Tokyo and New York and etc. It's a great opportunity for these kids. And they actually make quite a lot of money. I mean, the prizes are quite generous. And finally, it's mentorship. People starting business, we try and help them, and we try and guide them as to how to start the business, give them contacts, access to lawyers, etc. So those are the 4 legs that we have. Just want to talk about the next 2 events we're going to have. Next month we're going to have opportunities in genomics, and I know Mitch is over here, and I won't do justice to his talk, but basically what we'll talk about, and he's going to moderate the talk, I mean, Dr. Mitch Matz. We're going to talk about what is genomics all about, what's the technology all about, how do people use it. We're going to have, I believe, 1 or 2 physicians and oncologists. They talk about how the new revolution of genomics is being used in the marketplace, and also talk about opportunities for entrepreneurs. In April, we're going to have the same thing, opportunities in telemedicine. And again, we have a very distinguished panel coming, and it's the same thing, what's happening in this space. So our mission is to try and bring panels and speakers in, different topics. Last month, we had something on wearable devices. It was a sold-out event. We had about 80 people, and it was really a nice function. So those are the next 2 events we're going to have. Before I introduce Deepa, I have a couple of announcements. First, I'd like to introduce some of our charter members. Now, most of our activities, we try and give back to the community, but someone's got to pay for this. So we try and steal from our charter members. I'm like a modern day Robin Hood. I try and steal from these guys, and I put it back into the activities that we have each day. So I really am deeply appreciative and very grateful to our charter members. We have Nikhil, and I'll introduce them all. Vani Chawla, we have Mitch Matz, Gayatri, Prahalad, Hayden Trubit, and Dinesh Srinang Patnam. Sorry, Dinesh, I murdered your name. I apologize. So thank you. Let's give them all a... Now, Deepa's book, it's Predictable Magic. I believe there are 20 copies outside. And we asked Deepa very nicely. I think she might even autograph those books for you. So again, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. I believe it costs $20, which is a huge discount from the published price. So Deepa, thank you very much for making it available to our members. On March 30th, we're going to have Dance Beats of the World. And I believe the Indian dancers, the Korean dancers, Hungarian dancers, possibly Irish dancers, Japanese drums. It's at the Poway Center, and Dr. Madhavan is over here. He's very involved in doing things like, wonderful events he brings to the community. So I believe there are flyers around, and you can talk to Dr. Madhavan, March 30th at the Poway Center. Finally, I'm going to introduce Deepa, and if I went through her resume, she's really very distinguished. She's done a lot. So I've picked up snippets from her resume, and I'm going to talk about that. Deepa is a published author and a business strategist. In 2008, she researched and co-authored a book, and the book is Predictable Magic: Unleash the Power of Design to Transform Your Business. It was published by Wharton School Publishing, and it was chosen as one of the Fast Company's Design Books of the Year. Her articles and blogs have been carried in the Huffington Post, the Harvard Business Review, and Bloomberg Business Week. Deepa, she speaks at business schools. She's spoken at USC and Harvard on design strategy. She was recently ranked number 34 on the inaugural list of 50 Thinkers 50 India list, and she's the only woman in that list. So please welcome Deepa, and she's going to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here, and the TiE San Diego chapter is particularly close to my heart. I was actually here more than 10 years ago when they had the first meeting in San Diego, the first chapter meeting, and I actually met my husband there. So every time I see the flyer and it says you never know where this could lead you, I am testament to that. So, and I also worked with a TiE-funded company that actually survived the dot-com boom and did well, and is still a going concern. So links to this chapter are very deep, and so it's great to be here. And I'm really excited to share some thoughts with you on this topic of design, because I think it really stretches across many industries, and it's particularly pertinent for entrepreneurs, because I think in a real sense, design can really make the difference between somebody telling you that you have a good idea and somebody funding you, somebody signing up and buying your product. And I think that's why it's important to understand. It's not also something that I think has to be completely mysterious. I think the beauty of innovation is that there are many different ways to deliver value to consumers, but there are some things that the great brands and great products all get right. And if we keep those in mind, I think it's quite helpful as you're looking through how you design and present yourself. But to demonstrate my point, I think maybe the simplest thing is, let me give everybody a short quiz. I think Apple is probably the company that comes to mind of a large company that's shown us the power of design. And so let me ask everyone here, I think most of you would have interacted with Apple products. What is Apple's mission statement?
Think different.
That's the advertising campaign that they had, very successful advertising campaign. I think that's part of my central message to you here. When buried deep in their website, this is Apple's mission statement. Apple is committed to bringing the best personal computing experience to students, educators, creative professionals, and consumers around the world through its innovative hardware, software, and internet offerings. As bland and generic as they come. There is no think different in this at all. But here is a quote from Steve Jobs. Man is the creator of change in this world. As such, he should be above systems and structures and not subordinate to them. And I think for most people, whether you're a fan of Apple or not, that speaks to the experience of interacting with an Apple product. Everyone may not afford it, everyone may not like it, but everybody can use it pretty easily. And I think that is what is happening in business today, that people aren't really waiting to download your mission statement. They're making a judgment about who you are and your values based on what you put out on the shelf, based on what you put on the website. And so I think it's important that you really deeply understand your strategy so you can guide your company, but what you really have to understand is from the consumer's point of view, all that soul-searching matters very little. For the consumer, the relationship works the opposite way. If they're very intrigued or interested in what they're seeing, then they will become interested in your strategy. And really, I think it's important to look at design not as a cool packaging or a veneer, but really as a means to connect with people. And once you're able to do that, it can become quite a significant source of strategic advantage. And so I would like to spend some time today really talking about how and why does design create value? What are some of the ingredients? What are some of the elements of narrative? And maybe what are some of the unseen, I would say, critical success factors in deploying design? So really, if you want your business to connect, there are two primary ways to do that. One is through your offering, and the other part is through your story and narrative. And both of those, I would like to share some points of how you can think through these things. And to show you, first of all, maybe what's at stake, I think it's important to understand design really transforms market size. And you can see how profound that is. I know Arlene is here, Marty's not here today, but you can see this in cell phones. It really isn't a question of people having enough income. It's also when something is offered in a form that is interesting and energizing and exciting, you create markets with design, not just with having an acceptable income level. But design also creates impact. Ideas don't have impact in a vacuum. There's still a creation of rituals, a creation of practices, laying out a logic for people. And I think, India and Gandhi are a classic example of that. The idea of independence certainly did not originate with him, but it was a set of rituals, a set of practices that many people had access to that created the result. And I think both of these things also demonstrate an important point that design isn't really some secret language of a high-end product. It's a means to create community, to share ideas. And whatever your internal process, ultimately in the marketplace, design is what changes the game. If you look at all of these, with the exception of the iPad, all of these, the Nano in India, from India's Tata, one laptop per child, all of them have not been runaway commercial successes. But I think what they have all done is really challenge assumptions about what's possible, both inside and outside their industry. So Apple has created a conversation about usability that stretches far beyond its borders. The Nano's talked about low-cost transportation, being inclusive, and the same thing. I think the one laptop per child really started the conversation about how we could collaborate more deeply to solve global problems. And I always think of the questions my dad always used to ask as tests for innovation. Will it change the conversation? Does it show the opportunity? Will it lead to some action? And I think that all of these three would probably pass that test. And I think we're at a point now where business has also changed, it seems, from beyond profit alone to taking on thornier challenges. And today, pretty much all strategic challenges require design. If you're talking about co-creation, consumer experience, how we now design for 50 countries rather than maybe a handful of territories, how do we innovate, how do we create new business models? There are really none of those things that you can do purely by doing things the old way. And I think because of the IT revolution, a lot of people and big data, a lot of people can look and understand trends. So you don't get a lot of credit today for insight alone. So I could look at these trends and say, well, sure, there are higher divorce rates than there were 30 years ago. There are a lot of dual income families. There are people who are co-parenting. There are same-sex couples. All of us know that. We don't need big data. We don't need reports. We may not know the exact dimensions, but I think these things are pretty obvious. What entrepreneurs and successful companies do is translate those trends. You put up a diaper change in the men's bathroom. You help people navigate that change and make their lives a little bit easier. And that is how you create impact, you create profit, and you create awareness of your brand. And they always seem obvious when somebody else has done them. That's the beauty of it. And I also think that nuances matter. And I put this up mainly to say it's not sometimes just the products in any category that look alike. Sometimes even the people leading the companies look kind of alike. And the point is, you know what? It doesn't matter, because when you go one level deep, this really shows that design is not about the appearance of anything. Everybody who's in technology understands there is a different set of values, a point of view that underlies all these three companies and what they're about. There's a different narrative that all of these three people have. They're all talented, all gifted. But I think this really is there, that design is really 3 levels deeper under the surface. And I think if you're an entrepreneur starting out and you have aspirations to become a brand, you really need to see how profound today the convergence between design and brand really is. If I looked at all of these logos, I wouldn't need an explanation about these companies, what they stand for, what their products are. I may not be a consumer, I may not be a fan, but there is an instant recognition there. And I think today, when you're competing in 20 different countries and all these different income levels, advertising alone is not going to carry your message. There has to be something that's instantly recognizable in order to capture attention. So today, brand leaders are design leaders. They have a distinct look, feel, and experience, and that experience must be valued by consumers. And I think there's a very interesting finding that just came out today. There's a study by the Design Management Institute where they identified in the last decade a consortium of 15 companies across industries that had invested heavily in design. And when I say that, I don't mean they hired a very expensive star designer. They had leadership that championed design. They had people invest in innovation. They were willing to spend outside of their industry norms in understanding consumers. And what they're saying is that their results outpaced the S&P by 224%. Much of that was due to Apple, but even taking them away, they still outpaced the S&P by 58%. So I think we can now really make the case that this investment is not something that is simply, frivolous or depends on somebody having blind faith. I think there are demonstrable results from investing in the right kind of design activities. And what I'm really getting at is strategy and design today. You don't get to it by doing things the old school way, gather a group of friends, go to a nice sunny place, and find an idea that kind of looks like fun for all of you. The real breakthroughs that we're talking about really come from leaving the comfort zone, really investing in empathy and understanding people who think differently, who have very different lifestyles. And that's what a lot of the best companies have really done. And it's about creating meaningful experiences. I don't know if everyone can read that, so I'm just going to read this. Dilbert said, our goal is to ship 1 million units this quarter. Do we have any goals that involve making customers happy? No. I'm talking about our goals, not their goals. Oh, totally different. That's the old stereotype of how a lot of companies have operated. But I think, again, today, based on quantitative data, those who do feel that there's something about responding to aspirations don't have to really feel alone. Again, I think there are some demonstrable financial benefits for companies that have done so. And I think it's also obvious that whether you like design or not, if you look at brand rankings and how brand value can change just year to year, if you see 2012 and 2013, the names on these interbrand rankings haven't really changed, but the percentage of growth can change dramatically. The brand value associated with those shifts is huge. And if you really look at the period of 1 year, you're really talking about how profoundly the fortunes of companies can shift based on a finite number of new product introductions. If you see Apple in 2011, that is the impact of the iPad, 129% growth and perceived brand value, just huge. And in 2013, they take over Coca-Cola, which hadn't been done since the start of the rankings in 2000. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but what we're basically seeing is a lot of these marketing metrics are somewhat subjective, but I think the core message is the same, that there is a lot at stake in getting this right. And I think if not for no other reason, that's a pretty compelling reason to pay attention to design. I also think that the ability to connect emotionally through your offerings does lead to business results. The old way that people used to do financial analysis was to look at a lot of stock returns. So business classics like good to great would look at outperforming companies and then drill back and try to see what were the common practices across those companies. But I think there was a movement that started about a decade ago where they tried to do the analysis the opposite way and said, let's just go talk to people. Let's see which companies they really love to do business with. But there had to be a tangible way to measure that. Are you willing to drive a few extra miles? Are you willing to spend a little more? How much do you really know about the company? Do you tell your friends about it? And what they found was this very different group of companies in a lot of unusual industries, and they found a huge overperformance over their peers. So they found that people who really deeply invested in creating a good consumer experience had a steady performance over a 3-year period. They began to outperform over 5 years. And the outperformance was a 3-to-1 over 10 years. And I think this has some very interesting and exciting news for entrepreneurs. All the time you spend investing in consumer experience is worthwhile. I think there's 4 really interesting lessons that at least I draw from this data. Is one, it's really possible to add value regardless of sector. This is just an abridged list of the initial group of companies, but nobody would really be going out there today and saying, I can't wait to start an airline. But you see Southwest and JetBlue among those, so you can create a meaningful experience just about anywhere. Number 2, connecting with consumers is an advantage that grows. That's not true if you have a particular point of IP necessarily, unless it's something really, really unique. But in most consumer industries, that's not necessarily great. If you have a low cost advantage, if you have a particular look, those things can easily be copied. The emotional connection that you have with consumers is one of the few things that actually has a cumulative growth. Also interesting is there really isn't one single price point or aesthetic. I think when we see very successful companies like Apple, the immediate impulse is to try and copy the aesthetics. But if you look at this group of companies, they all represent very different things. You have Google, in the way many of us use it every day, is free. I mean, we map and we do search, and then you have BMW, where you have a luxury brand. You have random things like UPS, IKEA. So there's all price points at which you can create meaningful experiences. And I think the other thing is that frequency of interaction leads to trust and connection. So when you see things that look a little odd, like UPS or Costco or Whole Foods, a lot of that can be explained by the fact that you have many different opportunities to interact with that brand. And so it becomes a part of your life. And I think the question that I would take away from that is, since this data has been published, some of these companies have had problems. So I think as an entrepreneur, a question you can always look back on is the message, is what I'm pursuing important enough that it would outlive my company if, God forbid, something happens? Because if you look, Toyota had major quality problems a few years ago, but nobody's really pushing back on the idea that employees need to be empowered and should be able to make suggestions from the shop floor. Whole Foods certainly had a lot of issues in 2008 because their prices were simply too expensive, but some of their strategic difficulty has come because their value proposition is so compelling. It's being copied by grocery stores, it's being copied in a lot of places. So I think this is an important question. Is what I'm pursuing really important enough that it can withstand some of the ups and downs in the environment? But still, this leaves the problem. If there isn't a single price point, what is common across these very different brands? How can we deconstruct and understand what that magic is? What is it that accounts for the following that all of these very different products and services have? And that was really the point of research in the book my co-author and I embarked on. And I think this is the conclusion we came up with. It's not how you feel about the design, it's how it makes you feel about yourself. Great brands make people feel good about themselves at their core. That's what they all deliver. Some positive feeling about yourself, not purely about the company. And I know this can seem very murky and a little flaky, and especially I know there's a lot of people in biotech and everything, so probably even more so to them. But again, emotions are not talking about your childhood experiences and everything. I think there's a fairly finite set of emotions that create this kind of response. And there's a firm called Cheskin that has basically identified what some of those are, and I'll share those with you. And I think when you're creating, you just really need to come to whatever you're doing with the understanding that you're here to design a better life. I think there's this age-old debate about whether consumers really know what they want or not. And I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I look at Cinderella's story, and she asked the fairy godmother for a dress because that's what she knew to ask for. But the fairy godmother understood she was asking for a better life. And I think that if you are in a creative field, if you're in medicine, whatever it is, you need to come to it with that understanding. Because if you try to solve all problems for all time, you become debilitated very quickly. But if you think about how you can help people, you tend to become energized, you tend to attract other people to your cause, and build from there. And so what are the ingredients of a good design, actually? I think we all know looks, appearance, packaging, features, retail setting. Those are things we've all been trained to look for. I think the really great brands make some innovations in usability, in narrative, and forge an emotional connection with their consumers. And these are some of the universal emotions that really tend to resonate across ages, across cultures. And a lot of brands have a resonance that's not just, oh, like something cool. This is all from work that's been done over many years, interviews with probably 100,000 people worldwide. And this idea, a lot of the thing about apps, about all these things, the attraction is the idea that I am a creator, creation. Nike, it's not about sports, it's about accomplishment. The shoes make you feel like you can take on a challenge that you wouldn't be able to take on by yourself. A lot of the marketing that's done to parents for all these overpriced baby products is about the idea of fulfilling your duty. Those are things that people find gratifying. And there are certainly more here, but no brand does all of them. The very best brands probably touch 2 or 3 at the most, but they do it very well. And you can see from just maybe a visual example how powerful this merging of design, emotion, and narrative really is. Why are we attracted to the Dyson story? It's this something compelling about this guy who tried 5,000 iterations to get something right. And if I were to say who would be the richest industrial designer in the world with who's 4.4 billion net worth, you are not going to say the person who created a new vacuum cleaner. And there's no consumer in the world who could ever be polled and be told, you know what, please, what I'm looking for in a vacuum is something 3 times the cost of everything else. I want it to be bright yellow. And please, take away the bag because I have a morbid fascination with all the dust on my floors and I look at it before I throw the dust cup away. Nobody's ever going to tell you that. That is what comes from spending the time, agonizing, and finally sticking to what you have to do. And there aren't too many people willing to do that. And I think a lot of the marketing and emerging markets, people trying to reach the last mile, a lot of social entrepreneurship, the emotional payoff for both the consumer and for the provider and for the entrepreneur is this sense of validation, creating a sense of justice, that you're making the world a better place in some way, that somehow we're all connected. So this is what I'm talking about, and these kind of emotions can be measured, they can be understood. People on both sides can be polled, and it's an objective process. It's not a direct one-to-one, but it's not something that is as flaky as it may seem at first. And if you really look at the top global brands today, there's this huge, huge prevalence of technology that really wasn't there 30 years ago. People used to bond with personal care products, with food, and with cars. And today, if you look at the top 10 brands, 6 of them are technology companies. I mean, how many people can really explain to you on the street what a microprocessor is? Why is Intel up there? It just demonstrates that people respond to brands, to messages, and they come to care about companies depending on the narrative they hear. And there really isn't a category where this thinking isn't relevant. And if you look at the transformation and the accomplishments of people like Steve Jobs in this context, I think, this probably represents a lot of people 20 years ago. Frustration looking at the computer, both of them thinking, can't you do anything right? I know I used to write papers out on a yellow pad and then type them into the word processor in high school. And I think this is the transformation that Steve Jobs has created.
For 2010, we're going to take the biggest leap since the original iPhone. And so today we're introducing iPhone 4. Fourth generation iPhone. Now, this is really hot. And there are well over 100 new features, and we don't have time to cover all of them today. So I get to cover 8 of them with you. 8 new features of the iPhone 4. The first one, an all-new design. Now, stop me if you've already seen this. Believe me, you ain't seen it. You've got to see this thing in person. It is one of the most beautiful designs you've ever seen.
I think this really shows this is the transformation he enabled. And in some sense, when you see that he has taken that hesitation, almost that fear of using technology, and really transformed it into that level of excitement and enthusiasm, I think you can look at the accomplishments of a lot of people who create in a different context. If you can do that, you know what, it wouldn't have mattered that much whether the thing was silver. It probably could have been polka dot, it probably could have been black, it could have been many things. That's not what's really meaningful about what he did. I think it's making people embrace something new with confidence, with enthusiasm, and I think that's the way you can kind of look at a lot of very innovative companies and what they've done. They've led you to a place that you may have been scared to go to, in a way that made you still feel in control, but still you trusted them enough to take you on a journey. And that is what is really meaningful with emotional connection. And by the way, later in this demo, a lot of the features that he was trying to demo crashed. But nobody ever turned around and said, we don't care if Apple succeeds. A lot of even financial analysts who are the most unforgiving turned around and said, the iPhone 4 demo failed. That's evidence that Steve Jobs is human. And they kind of laughed it off because people still wanted the company to succeed. And I think that's where connections are so important, because innovation is an inexact process. You can't guarantee an outcome. You can try your best, you can take all the polls, but ultimately you don't know. And those connections are just as important when things fail, sometimes even more so, because you have a group of people invested in your success who are willing to help you, be patient while you fix problems. I think the Target data breach is another great example. I stayed away for about 2 weeks, and then I said, I'm so sick of driving around town, I'm just going to deal with it and take their free credit monitoring for whatever it's worth. And that's what happens when you have a bond with an organization. And so we really try to give a systematic view. I'm not going to go deep into the methodology of the book. I just wanted to say this is kind of the task we were trying to undertake when writing the book. And what we did is looking at strategy in the very same way that a lot of strategists would start, trying to understand how is the industry changing, look at maps of competing products and try to derive patterns and see where there are unmet needs. How are consumers evolving? What are the behaviors that can guide us? In a new product category, you don't have things to line up. You don't have those reference points. So what kind of clues can you take from other areas to inform how you design things? what are they responding to in other areas of their lives, and where are their emerging opportunities. And those three questions are very significant, and I think they're more than enough to start a design process. But what I would like to do is actually show some real life examples of how different companies have used design and had very interesting results. And they're not necessarily things that we've worked on, but I think they're just sometimes actually seeing it is more helpful than listening to theory. So looking at a company like Hyundai, which began selling cars in the US about 25 years ago. This is their first ad. That's all they could sell. It's affordable. And that was the kindest review they got, was they said it was an acceptable alternative to a used car. That was the nicest. But most others are kind of, it was just laughed at. It wasn't even reviewed. But they had a very counterintuitive strategy. They actually said, we may be the cheapest, but we're also going to offer the best warranty in America. And when people came through their doors, they really shadowed people and followed them for long periods of time to understand what they were interested in, what drew them to try that car. And surprisingly, they actually sold 168,000 cars in 1986, which was almost double their original estimates. And they continue to shadow customers, see them as they evolve from these impoverished students into, young working people, new parents. And they released a lot of concept cars in the car shows that actually never came to market. Their first SUV was introduced in 1999. That was a 13-year journey. Their first mid-size car in 2000, first luxury car in 2007. But I think what's interesting is what drove a lot of their recent success wasn't only the car itself. It was understanding deeply the mindset of consumers. In 2008, they basically realized, and the financial crisis was just starting, a lot of people who were financially able to buy a new car didn't, not because of really lack of money, it was lack of certainty. It was insecurity about the future, about their jobs. So they offered this Hyundai Assurance Program, which basically said in case you have a job loss, if you have medical impairment, we will take the car back within 2 years with no damage to your credit history. And this is at a point when all of their competitors were basically trying to use rebates, zero down, all these gimmicks. They basically said, we understand there's an emotional hesitation underlying people's behavior. And this had an immediate impact, a 14% increase in sales in the first year. And then they actually were able to get a whole new class of people who were downgrading, who were interested in saving gas. And by studying them, they were able to kind of finalize aspects of their design, and their Hyundai Genesis was voted one of the best new cars of 2009, and it was at a much higher price point than previous ones. And everybody stood up and took notice. And they had huge results in the next few years. They went from the 11th to the 4th largest car maker. They had an announced goal of having the highest fuel economy by 2012. They didn't get there. They found out that they were fudging some of their results, but that's an aside. But they were named the #1 upward climbing brand, top in brand loyalty. Because why? Because they were there for people during a difficult time. That's a lot of it. And now they're able to release cars like the Equus, a $58,000 price tag, multiple safety and design awards, and this is their new ad campaign that was released during the Oscars.
This isn't just an app. It's the owner's manual of the new Equus from Hyundai.
Yeah, I mean, that's a far cry from somebody saying it's an alternative, to a used car. I think when people see that kind of transformation, they will become interested in your strategic process. You're not going to have to beg for a seat at the table. People will probably be knocking on your door to partner with you to understand how you did it. And I think that's one of the really powerful aspects of design. And there are cases like this across industries. And I think what I would like to do is just say that, you know, there are lots of different ways in which innovation is delivered, but there are probably 3 big buckets which we can look at a lot of new products and try to understand what's exciting and interesting about them. There are 3, I think, big buckets to enhance the consumer experience. My 2 cents worth here. Now I know Cisco bought FlipCam and completely ruined it and ran it to the ground. But when the FlipCam was introduced, at that point in time, other than a cell phone, there really wasn't a camera that was acceptable and produced good quality pictures. And they basically said, let's bring the simplicity of a Polaroid into a still camera, and or digital camera rather. And they also said, look, we also understand that the camera market really isn't growing, the digital camera market, the way the still camera market did. And they realized it was becoming so feature rich that all the people they were attracting were hobbyists, a lot of people who were professionals or quasi-professionals. And they said the body of people who need to capture memories are much wider than that. What about the grandmas, the moms, the friends? Why don't we have something battery powered that you can stick in a bag and just take with you? And let's also make the sharing of those photos easy, because ultimately photography is about memories. And so they just had a very finite set of features. And of course now the quality of cell phone cameras has improved, the quality of Cisco strategy has declined. So this isn't as relevant now, but I'm just using it as an example that simplifying things down to the basics. You know, people like Steven Spielberg were seen carrying around a flip cam. So these aren't people who don't have access. They said 50% of the people who ordered on Amazon already owned multiple cameras. So if you design something well, you shouldn't be saying, well, this group of customers already has this, they're not interested. The quality of your design determines your market size. Again, I can't overemphasize that point. The other thing is, everyone always tells you if you're an entrepreneur, go for what you're passionate about. But I mean, honestly, sometimes it can work the other way. How can you neutralize or create a positive experience from something that isn't that enjoyable? If everybody loved doing dishes, we would not have dishwashers, and what a horrible world that would be. So taking something that, and just making it a bit more pleasant is also a really good point. I mean, solving pain points. And TurboTax, SnapTax, who looks forward to doing their taxes? You know, nobody, but can I make it a neutral? Can I make it a positive? Can I make it take less time? All of these are really important benefits. And let's see, I think this is the one of the 2 videos that's being a little annoying. So even playing a video about taxes can be painful. Here it goes. There is huge value in neutralizing or creating a positive from something that's not something that anyone looks forward to. And actually not even a lot of CPAs. So, you know, this is another way to look at it. And I think this is also a pretty powerful example of just enhancing the consumer experience.
South Korea is a unique market. Tesco has been evolving itself, adjusting to the local market. It even changed the name itself from Tesco to Home Plus. And at last, it grew to rank number 2 in Korea. But Tesco had to overcome one obstacle, a fewer number of stores compared to the number 1 company, E-Mart. Mission: Could we become number one without increasing the number of stores? We made an in-depth study into Koreans once more. Koreans are the second most hardworking people in the world. For them, grocery shopping once a week is a dreaded task. So we decided to approach these busy and tired people. Idea: let the store come to the people. We created virtual stores, hoping to blend into people's everyday lives. Our first try was subway stations. Although virtual, the displays were exactly the same as actual stores, from the display to the merchandise. Only one thing was different. You use smartphones to shop. Scan the QR code with your phone, and the product automatically lands in your online cart. When the online purchase is done, it will be delivered to your door right after you get home. People can relax more after work and on weekends.
실제로 보면서 사니까 진짜 더 좋은 것 같아요. 편하기도 하고.
Result: people can shop at Tesco Home Plus wherever they go without having to visit the actual store. Moreover, we could change their waiting time to shopping time. After this campaign, online sales increased tremendously. Through this campaign, 10,287 consumers visited the online Home Plus mall using smartphones. The number of new registered members rose by 76%, and online sales increased 130%. Currently, Home Plus has become number one in the online market and is a very close second offline.
I mean, this is an extreme example of really thinking outside the box. I just wish I had a sign like that on the back of my house that I could scan, save myself all the driving around I do. The other thing you need to think about is when you're offering something new, I think as innovators, we tend to get really excited about this is new, it's different, forgetting that for consumers, there's an inherent risk. And you have to overcome entrenched behavior, and that is very difficult and very threatening. So one of the things that you can really do is help people de-risk their purchase, give them an opportunity to try what you're doing in a way that preserves, their perception of risk. And I think new technology purchases are really one of those things where Best Buy had a program called Future Proof, where they basically said, yes, things like TVs, handhelds, it does become debilitating because you always feel someone's going to come up with something new the minute you buy something. And to overcome that, they created a guaranteed buyback price for a whole variety of high-end electronics. And how can you provide the comfort to a new adopter? How can I ease anxiety? Those are the questions rooted in empathy that can make a really interesting difference. And this ad, once you've done that thinking, I think then the narrative almost comes naturally. You're able to really speak and help people understand your internal process very easily.
It is the newest.
Even newer. Everything else is obsolete. Oh, wait. 4D. The new buyback. You buy it now, we buy it back when the new thing comes out.
So from a pricing perspective, this program wasn't that financially beneficial for consumers, but it provided a comfort. I don't have to go to Craigslist and have dodgy people coming to my house. I don't have to deal with all these other headaches. It was just something that was clear and well understood. And all of these things that I've showed you, I think they're all interesting, compelling, but in some sense, don't they just seem so deeply obvious? And you have to ask yourself, why do we have so many talented people inside all these organizations? And what is it about our process that makes these so exceptional? Why do we have this talent for killing good ideas? And I actually think there's some reasons that are important to understand that have nothing to do with people not being open-minded, nothing to do with bureaucracy, office politics. I think there's some legitimate reasons why aligning design and strategy are so hard. And I'm going to share some of those because I think awareness itself can sometimes help you. One is simply the language that different parties use in this process creates a challenge, because if you're a designer, you are showing your vision of the future in a sketch. If you're a marketing and accounting person, you're showing your vision of the future in a spreadsheet. Now, both of those are assumptions. You know, the accounting stuff may look more quantitative and more rigorous. It really isn't. I mean, it's your best guess of how things might look. But then the question is, how do you do a tie break? You can't just price out a design and say, I'm going to take this and this away, because that's going to have a significant impact on the consumer experience. So both parties really need to invest in creating a common language in order for these differences to be resolved, because there are always inevitable trade-offs when you're implementing and bringing things to market. The second one is, you know, you have to become an interpreter. And I just always think of my son when he was about 3.5. I took him for a haircut, and he sat in the chair, and she kept asking, do you want it short on the sides? Do you want this? Do you want that? And he just looked at her and shrugged and said, hey, just make me look cool. And, you know, most consumers aren't going to go in and do that. I mean, people aren't going to come in and say, make me look thin, all that. But I mean, the fact is, that's what you're charged with doing as a business, is understanding what's the deeper level payoff that we're looking for. And the other thing, I think you need to become an interpreter, because when you have put your heart and soul into creating something, you tend to want to share minute details of what went into it and how it happened, and not understanding that from the consumer's point of view, what's really important is the experiences I'm going to have as a result of owning that object. That's what's meaningful to people outside, and I think you always have to learn how to strike a balance between those two things. And the other thing is, you have to really accept individual diversity. People attach different meanings to the same object, and I think that this ad campaign from HSBC really strikes at that. That, you know, for some people a car may be freedom, for someone else it's a status symbol, for someone else it's a polluter. And everything can be framed by that. And I think you can be more successful by understanding what those frames different people look like, you know, what they have, what their perceptions are, and then you can tend to create something that at least, you know, neutralizes opposition to what you're trying to do. And the other thing that's hard for designers and business people is to understand that really the fact that you've observed something doesn't mean you understand the underlying phenomenon. I'm always reminded about this joke of this NGO who went into Afghanistan and spent a lot of time mentoring all these women and came away kind of disappointed. He said, well, we spent all this time, we've given these women loans, their children are in school, they're running their own business, and why are they still walking 50 feet behind their husbands? And one of the new guys actually went out and asked, and this woman shrugged and said, hey, the place is full of landmines. So, I mean, you know, sometimes there are these puzzles that you just can't figure out. But once you understand what's driving the behavior, you can really get to the core of it. And truly, there have been cases like that. I am forgetting the name of the design firm, but they said they went to Brazil into some really rough neighborhoods. And they were really shocked to find that very poor families were spending about 30% of their disposable income on cable TV. And they were appalled. They said, you know, you get more disposable income, why wouldn't you spend on food, on better education, on anything? And as a result of their interviews, a lot of these people said, the neighborhood is so dangerous and so crime-ridden, we get the best cable we can afford so our kids stay inside. Then it becomes very hard to be judgmental. And in fact, they ended up partnering with the cable companies not only to lower the cost, but also provide better programming. And there's a lot of stories like that. It's an inexact process, and that's why I think people can always copy the veneer of what you do, but understanding at that level is not something that comes easily, and that's not something everyone can just copy. And you can't speak to people credibly just because your thing kind of looks like what somebody else did. And you can always find a way to get around the patent, but deeply understanding people is an advantage that is sustainable. And I think this just leads me to the role of narrative. I think a lot of CEOs, especially in technology and biotech, places where people have a knee-jerk reaction, have fear, have to spend a lot of time really explaining what their story is, what their point of view is. And I don't think when we talk about sharing your narrative, I don't think it's about sharing your childhood and all those things. People have different personalities. You have to do what is comfortable to you. But as a leader, I think you have to really have some critical tasks under your belt, is communicate your intentions. What people really want to know, what are you working on? How are you trying to make the world a better place? And they also want to know if their own ideas matter. So I think people can look at somebody like Mark Zuckerberg and all these people and say, oh, they're little brat. They have a point of view about how they think the world needs to look. They've worked on it for a decade, and I think they have interesting things to say to all of us. It's not about, copying somebody's website in some fashion. They've had a tremendous impact on how the world works. And the other thing is, explain how this is going to fit into my life. Why is this important to me? Why do I need to monitor my health? Why do I need to have, genetics testing? How is I going to feel? How do I respond and process that information? Those are all the questions that people have, and I think as a leader, those are the kinds of questions you need to have a point of view about and explain very clearly. And the other thing in terms of narrative is not personal history necessarily, but show people what it took you to get there. Johnson & Johnson has gone beyond industry standards in terms of disclosure about what's in their products. Steve Jobs, this is what we did. And even people who wrote his obituary, like Eric Schmidt, said, hey, that guy came under the worst health circumstances and he forced himself to go there because he wanted to do something. And people respond to that. They understand what it's about. And I think as you're going through and trying to really create a design-driven culture, even as an entrepreneur, it doesn't mean that you have to hire star designers. I don't think it means that you need to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every single color and texture. It helps. I think some investment in artistry and design methods helps. But I think the most important thing for any size company to create an innovation culture is very simple. Have decent governance. And this is not a very obtuse quasi-religious thing. Governance is not something that's just kind of nice to have. You can't innovate without it, and I think there's some practical reasons. One, innovation outcomes are uncertain. You don't really know today the cost and the risk of putting something out to market is huge. So, why is it that we have an Occupy Wall Street movement and we never had an Occupy Silicon Valley movement when all the dot-coms went bust? I think it's because people understood the risks, they were explained to them, and they understood your odds are what they are. So you have to be transparent about process. You can't necessarily guarantee an outcome. And today, complex problems involve many different players. It's not something that a single company can do, sometimes not what a single government can do. So unless you're sharing information in a transparent fashion, you're not going to really get too far on any of these things. And the cycle times are longer. I mean, nobody's just saying, I'm going to put out a green t-shirt to counter my competitor's red t-shirt. There's an experience, there's hardware, there's software, there's a lot of intelligence wrapped up into very seemingly simple products. So given all the complexities and all the parties involved, you really need to have clear communication. And today also, we kind of touched on this problem of consumers not being able to really tell you in a poll what they want exactly. To get a good innovation today, you need to go to a deeper level, really understand and have relationships with consumers so you can even begin to guess at what they want. And people do not share hopes and dreams with people they don't know and they don't trust. They share it with people they perceive as their friends. And companies need to be trusted. They need to be perceived as a friend and somebody who is working with good intentions towards something. And co-creation is just a non-starter unless parties have faith in each other's ability to respect rules of the road. And I think you see this applies really to countries as well. The countries that are highly innovative are also very high, relatively high on the innovation, on the transparency ranks. So I don't think any country needs to be perfect, but I think you need to be basically decent if you have any hope of innovating effectively over a period of time, if you have any hope of attracting investment. I don't think anybody, even the best among us, has a great idea every day. But the main thing to remember is don't do things that really inhibit your ability to collaborate later on. And the other really tangible benefit of transparency, I think, today is an increasing portion of enterprise value is really being driven on intangible assets. And a lot of those things, knowledge, business system, those are the things within the firm that are, in a way, soft measures of the amount of trust. Nobody gets patents, nobody gets human capital, it attracts the best people without trust. And the market position and brand really speaks to the kind of trust a company is enjoying outside of its borders. So if you really see that, some countries like India, 76% of enterprise value is in intangibles because there's been a heavily skewed towards services, you can see that there is a bottom line impact to having good transparency and to not having it. So that's something to keep first and foremost if you plan to innovate. And I think you really see this played out in a very dramatic fashion in the past couple of years. You have, on one extreme, a spontaneous vigil at the Apple store when Steve Jobs died, and you have the Occupy Wall Street movement. And ironically, Steve Jobs at one point, Apple had more cash on hand than the US government. So I don't think that all of this soul searching and all of these debates are really about anybody being envious about money. I think it's about people having expectations of fairness that are being violated, and that need for establishing trust is really critical. And I think that all of this, I think probably in this community more than others, all the new technology, all the biotech, the genomics, it's going to really create a need for this kind of dialogue in a very profound way, because all of these exciting developments carry with them a lot of moral ambiguity, and you have to have a sense of what's right and wrong before you really scale. I went to a presentation by the founder of 5 Hour Energy, and he said when they actually had their products start to become successful, they were growing at 6% a week. When it's growing at 6% a week, you're not going to have time for these debates inside the company. You're scrambling to ship. So you have to have a sense of right and wrong and what you believe far in advance of scaling. And you see this coming up over and over again in every industry. So Angry Birds used a software called Box 2D to develop its game. The creator of Box 2D didn't ask for anything, any financial reward whatsoever. At the same time, he claims he's not bitter. I think after Angry Birds made millions, they sent him a red sweatshirt as a thank you. So I'm not pretending I understand how these things should be negotiated, because technically they really don't owe him anything, and he says he's not bitter. But how we resolve and talk about these things does determine how open things might remain in the future. The same thing with 3D printing. Yes, we can save lives with printing out blood vessels. We can take lives printing out 3D guns. Where do we draw the lines? Creators must be prepared to have a voice on issues like this. 23andMe didn't comply with the FDA. They can give you a lot of interesting information. What do I do with that information? How far do I go? How secure is it? Are you prepared to tell me how I should act for my kids? Those are all the questions. So I don't think that even designers are going to solve all the world's problems. I think, we were brought up in a generation where everyone said, your knowledge is the one thing that nobody can take away from you. Probably not. That's probably true, but we probably don't have to spend 18 years in school to know what we know today anymore either. There's probably 10% that's unique and from experience. But nor is just being able to make something also going to give you that advantage. Because with 3D printing, if I get frustrated tomorrow, I can probably eventually go down to Kinko's and print out and create a solution to my own problem. So I think it's going to be the ability to go seamlessly between understanding the deeper meaning of things and creating some kind of a physical service or product that's going to really make the difference between people who are going to have an impact in the future. And I know that I'm really raising more questions than I'm answering in this part of my presentation. And that's the nature of business evolving. There aren't clear answers, but I always find myself when I'm negotiating all of these things, at least in my own mind, going back to one very simple question from my father that I think clarifies these things very quickly, is basically saying, who would be better off because of this work? Always keep that in mind as you're doing things, and you tend to fall to the right decisions, attract the right partners. And I do think that as much as a lot of innovation creates questions, it also creates a social transformation that's meaningful. If you look at even a country as historically open and inclusive as the United States, that was the signage 70 years ago, no colored allowed. And as we became a country that was focused on innovation, I think these are how the signs have started to change. Handicapped access, take care of the planet, multi-faith prayer room. That's an intangible that innovators and entrepreneurs and companies bring to society. It happens over a long period of time, but it's something that we can feel good about. And I can say that, if you really look at other countries and people who have widely raised living standards around the world in the last 20 years, they are undergoing this transformation at a much faster pace and wrestling with the same issues. And I think this is something that's tremendously important to keep in mind. And so I think just always remember, behavior is as important as income. There really isn't a big divergence most of the time between quantitative and qualitative data. They tend to reinforce each other. And looking at emotions creates obligations for companies. As you're studying people and observing them, you learn about what they want. You also learn about their fears, their insecurities, and you need to be very careful how you use that information. And a great design still needs a great business model. Ideas do not succeed in a vacuum. You have to have something more than that. The Apple experience wasn't delivered by Apple alone. They found a way to tap and reward people, hundreds of thousands of programmers far outside of their borders. And I think what's interesting is everyone focuses on how much money the company made. They have paid out more than $7 billion in royalties. And what's interesting is even the people who are rejected are made to feel valued because 90% of apps get a response within 10 days. It's pretty efficient. I mean, if I think about all the things sitting in my inbox that I haven't responded to, and I look at that, I am really humbled when I read that. And I think looking at emotions lends clarity, not complexity. Data alone can be really paralyzing, especially for global efforts. If you start with emotions and what people want to accomplish and how you can be of help, I think you can get a much better start and end up with a much better result. So I know I have been through a lot here, so I wish all of you the very best, and I am happy to take any questions that any of you may have.
I'll just start because everybody's kind of waiting. It's dinner time. It's dinner break. The liturgy, I guess. But great speech highlighting the need for design. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the second to last bullet which you have. A great design still needs a great business model. And if you look back at one of your slides, I think it had the order of the 10 top brands by Interbrand. And I think one of the brands that you had, just for convenience, is Samsung, and there was a 40% jump in the brand value. But the 40% jump, I think you could relate to the story of smartphone design, which kind of took the hearts and minds of consumers worldwide. But today, if you look at Samsung's business, they lost money, and the only reason they were still able to be in decent shape was semiconductor business. Mm-hmm. The designs are still great, their products are still great, but can you talk a little bit more about the great business model? Maybe clarify it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the interesting stories today are actually coming out not from the idea itself, but from delivery. And the App Store, I mean, is the ultimate success story, right? But then it also has to be widely understood. Everyone thinks that, okay, things scale when all the technology is stable and everything works. But, I mean, we all use Microsoft, and we know that used to crash all the time. I mean, so it's widely available, but there has to be an easily understood code doing that. I think what you're really alluding to, which I think is very important for people to understand, is that with technology, the switching costs have gone down a lot. So that's number one. And no strategy is invulnerable because designs themselves can be actually copied fairly easily today. And you also can get, people used to think of technology as a tool to learn about brands, and today technologies are brands in and of themselves. So I think all of these things really depend on, now everyone's saying, okay, well with Galaxy, what's going to happen to the iPad and everything else. So I think to some extent you need to really, this emotional connection piece becomes more relevant. Apple has evangelists that something like a Samsung doesn't have. I know when I was at one talk, everyone said, oh my God, well Samsung's is almost as good. I said, okay, so who's the CEO of Samsung? Blank stare. When is the Samsung Galaxy being released? Are you waiting in line for it? What you know about that is ultimately still the price. And if you are in that position as a company, then even if aspects of your design are good, it's still a vulnerable place to be. And even Apple now, they've said that they're stopped growing in North America. So I'm not saying that anybody is invincible because of design. I think the strategy and the design has to work together effectively. And even then, this game changes every year. And that's the beauty of design, because you're able to see who's capable of executing very quickly. I know that's not a direct answer to your question, but it is what it is. Nobody can answer that directly. It's having the portfolio and having the connection across industries sometimes is the only thing. You don't want to be the one-trick pony, and that's where connection makes a big difference. Having a string of collaborators.
There's a question here.
Nobody has a question, and I'd like to directly address the Samsung Apple store thing to you. Personal experience. I think I was one of the first buyers of their first Galaxy phones. And I was never into Apple. I had PCs and everything. And then for some reason, I had to give my Galaxy phone to my husband. And now I had to buy a phone myself. And if my daughter had an Apple, others had, and I said, okay, I'm going to give Apple a shot. Now, if you try to take me away from my Apple phone, it's going to require a thing. And I'll tell you one thing. When my Galaxy had a problem, I called Verizon. I said, I can't download this app. 40% of the apps would download, 60% wouldn't. They said, oh, that's a Samsung issue. Call this number at Samsung. I called Samsung. And Samsung technical people gave me the runaround. And it was very irritating because I had worked at Bell Labs and Qualcomm in cellular for 20 years. And these two companies are trying to give me the runaround on this, okay? So when I couldn't understand and what Samsung was trying to do, they were sending me back to Verizon saying, this is not an issue, you should call the app developer. I said, what? Okay. I went back to Verizon and they gave me the same review. I said, that's it. I went to Apple, I bought an Apple, and I bought it from Verizon, but then I went to the Apple store. And that is the end of the story. I have a problem, I go to UTC, I go to the Apple store, they solve my problem. So I tell every woman, look, if you want a pretty error-free life with your smartphone, start with an app.
If only they were in other categories.
As far as my smartphone is concerned and my iPad is concerned, so that is the problem with Samsung. They deliver the product, it's over the wall, and they don't care about the consumer experience. Apple, I feel, does. I may be wrong, others may disagree, but that's my personal experience. And when you ask this, I said, I have to tell you.
There's a question.
Just out of curiosity, that page had all these mega multi-billion-dollar companies, right? From your experience, what are some of the more emerging companies that we may not have heard that much about that are following good design concepts that we should be hearing about them in the future?
If I were to talk about outside of the United States, I think that what's really going to challenge a lot of these companies and the way they've operated is actually a lot of companies from India. Because if you really look at a lot of the brand rankings that are pretty much dominated by the United States and Europe, what you really have is people who are very firmly in a budget category, or they're very firmly in a luxury category. And I think it's going to be companies from India like the Tatas, because of the reality of India, they don't have a choice to just do one or the other. They have to really go across the spectrum, and they are going to be the emerging brands that can really speak to everybody. So if you look at something like a Tata Jaguar and a Tata Nano, of course the design language is completely different. But even the Nano has to be designed in a way that validates the decision of the Jaguar owner. And you can have two very different designs, but you can have then two different points of view about how consumers should be treated. You can have two different points of view about how you treat the environment, how you deal with safety. And I think that dealing with the reality of emerging markets will create some extremely strong names in probably very short order. I don't think it's going to take 20 years for those brands to be recognized around the world. That's, again, a big company, but to answer your question, I think a lot of these brands and the software expertise there is going to really challenge the traditional way of saying, well, I'm at the high end and I'm at the low end. I think that is going to go away. I don't think you need to sell to everybody today, but I think you do need to speak to everybody, and that's not a skill that a lot of companies in the luxury segments and even the budget segments have. We don't trust, Walmart to go and create a luxury brand or run one. And we're not going to look to those brands to go and create a budget item either, where the Coach, cheap purse looks like a cheap purse. Giving that kind of quality and validation across different price points is a skill that is going to take, I think, some time for Western brands to come up with, and I think that's something that countries like India can offer.
I'm a great fan of Sony. So I still have my third television from them, all my audio system from them. I kind of equate them to Apple, so I always like them. And their design is excellent, their product is always good. So what happened to them? Recently they are selling out their television units, they are not making money. They are fantastic innovation. You didn't even mention Sony in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not an expert on Sony, but I think the larger point that really design, even really good design, doesn't really succeed in a vacuum without a strategy behind it, is exactly what you're talking about. And then you can also see some companies where what they're putting out is just kind of subpar, and you sense that there's strategic weakness. And I think that's what's really interesting is, consumers are pretty savvy at seeing that. And when they don't like, how you answer other questions about privacy, about currency, some of it is intrinsic. Now what's the competitor to a lot of TVs in the category? Everyone jokes and says, the market is just changing. They say, TV is the background noise you put on while you're surfing the web. So part of it is there's just a larger macro level change at play here. So it's not a question of there not being good innovation in TVs. It's just that it's not as relevant as it used to be. Maybe people are watching on other devices. So that's a lot of the problem. And then the response to that can be slow if you're invested heavily in only one medium.
Maybe you can teach me and other design amateurs something through an example. I see the list of beloved companies, and it's easy for me to see why those are beloved companies, except for one, which is UPS. I certainly don't love UPS. I don't know anyone who does. I don't have any idea why it's on that list, but it's on a list. Could you tell me something that they have, which is excellent design, that their competitors like Federal Express don't have, which not only makes UPS better, but which puts them up into the stratosphere?
Yeah, I don't get that one either. I think there's just some really, really bored people out there who maybe just it's closer or it's cheaper or something. I don't really know. But that's the whole thing. There's some anomalies there where people probably go to UPS more frequently than a FedEx. And so there are these weird brands that you wouldn't expect people to have that kind of a link with. So you see like Whole Foods on one extreme in the grocery store. But just the fact that people are looking for very different types of experiences, Costco very deliberately creates these complete displays that are very disorganized on one level. And the thinking behind it is so interesting. They said, America, a lot of upper income Americans grew up in considerably more modest means. So they're used to doing things like bargain hunting and having to go to garage sales and things. So they actually like to feel like they haven't lost touch with their roots when they go hunting through and pretend they're going there for toilet paper and come out with an LCD TV. Somehow, why is it that you can have all these luxury cars in Carlsbad and the number one thing people are hauling out is like reams of toilet paper? Why? I don't know, but they've literally said it's basically membership bananas and toilet paper that drive whether people come in to that store. So these psychological factors sometimes are just hard to tease out and understand, but the ones that do can create profitable enterprises and a lot of other categories with that knowledge.
Question, can you also, to the UPS is a fascinating one, can you also build brands of your own around other people's business model? For example, the fact is, a lot of Amazon shipments come in UPS. So there's a huge amount of familiarity with it. So I don't know whether it's the design of UPS or the piggybacking off Amazon that somehow creates an attachment that somehow many of us can relate to. And maybe that's another element of the design picture as well in terms of business model.
Yeah, and I think that the geniuses of creating that ecosystem opportunity have really been Apple, because now you even have, $50 women's gloves with a little thing that you can do a touch screen with, in the winter. So they've created opportunity for people so far and wide. They're probably the experts, and that's the unacknowledged contribution that they've made outside of their own results is the amount of opportunity created for entrepreneurs.
I was thinking the same hypothesis about UPS because I'm a huge Amazon Prime person. Most of my shopping comes 2 days after I click on buy on Amazon. It comes in that brown wrapper. What can brown do for you? I think is also part of it. And I think part of it, and maybe you can speak to this as a question for you, there seems to be a fair number of cases where being number 2 was better. I mean, FedEx pioneered overnight shipping and 2-day shipping, and they're still big and they're still doing fine, but I don't think they're perceived as the go-to anymore. I think Brown, logistics, I think UPS, and so maybe you can comment on that. What is not only hitching your wagon to another star performer, but seeing somebody start to break into the industry and then swooping in as they clear a path? Can you comment on how design plays a role and how strategy plays a role in that, what seems to be a successful tactic many companies use?
Yeah, and I think especially in technology, there are just so many cases where people weren't quite ready for the kind of information. So even things that seemed like they would be accepted, I remember 10, 12 years ago, even things like GPS and all that, it was always seen as the first scenario is always a fearful one, that someone's trying to track you and keep tabs on you and somehow use that information to harm you. And it's only when it becomes very seamless and you see the value in it that you suddenly start to embrace it. And I think technology is one example, but even things like this low-cost car from India, the $2,500 Nano, they had a fantastic level of innovation, but again, the emotional connect was what even they say really didn't work. They billed it as the poor people's car, which really only appealed to rich people. I know the part of India I'm from is where they built a plant, and it's kind of interesting. They paid a lot of farmers a lot of money to build a plant, and the people who you would think would have been customers for that car actually took the money and went to the Audi dealership and the Mercedes dealership and drove away on that, and it was like, wow, that's kind of not what was expected. But now there is a new entrant that's been in motorcycles and supplies a lot of rickshaws called Bajaj that yesterday announced, well, it's not a rickshaw, it's like a safer alternative to a rickshaw, but they're not pretending it's a car. And now their opponents are saying, well, you just created an unsafe car, and they're saying, no, we created a safer rickshaw. But when you learn about that positioning, it remains to be seen. But second mover advantage, they actually didn't have to do the amount of work and the amount of study to create the actual design. So it's going to be one of those cases that's worth watching to see how it plays out.
I'd like to make a comment about my experience in starting Jitterbug that might be relevant to more of the startup people than the big brands. And that is, today with the connected devices that we have, it's almost impossible not to what I call design through and through. That is end to end. You have to design, certainly for the user experience of the product, forgetting all the collateral that goes on, the promotion and the after-sales support. But what I will say is, if you try to create a company like that that's based on design as a cold start, the startup, in contrast with building it out of Apple, which is what Apple did. I mean, they went from being a manufacturer to actually being a service provider with a revenue stream without getting into the carrier business. But if you try to start an end-to-end business by design, the chances of you getting funded are so much poorer than if your product is part of a supply chain. And I can't emphasize that more. The world is used to having a supply chain siloed out by component providers, finished goods providers like Samsung or others, the distribution channels, and the only one that touches the customer is the retailer. And most of the retailers, they want to sell something and get rid of you, only to maybe have you come back to their store. But an end-to-end product where most of this connected device stuff is going, whether it's medical or whatever, is really hard to fund because the venture people and the people that are backing it, they don't believe that one company can do it all. So some of the big brands might have money to do it all, but when I funded Jitterbug until we had 50,000 customers. It was an enormous risk, but nobody would fund that company, even with the backing of a custom device built by Samsung on their own expense. I didn't even pay for that, until we proved that we had done something that worked. So your design idea is perfect. That's not the issue. The issue is for startups, it's really hard to do a full-on service, a full-on program, just because of the way the market funds development of that idea. And oftentimes, by the way, that's because the startup team that's doing the technology cannot transition into the delivery of the service. And that's real. Mm-hmm. These people are not the same people very often. Yep. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, and I think it depend to some extent on the category itself, because I think what you're saying, technology is certainly the case. But if you look in consumer products at something like Method, what was their big thing? They really changed the packaging, and their promise was simply, this looks pretty sitting on your sink. It doesn't need to be put under this. And those were fairly simple products. The promise wasn't terribly complicated. But ironically, the big brands find something that's simple, seemingly simple, very difficult to respond to, because they have billions of dollars invested in you being able to walk through a grocery aisle and recognize that package and pick it up without even thinking about it. And I've worked with some big consumer products companies. They take 3 to 4 years to really approve a new fragrance for a laundry detergent, because they have to distribute it out to so many different territories and get retailers to sign up and give them shelf space. So you see some of these kinds of brands growing very quickly, the $700–800 million brands, and suddenly they're in the baby aisle. They're in all these other categories in a much more rapid succession than others. So I think you're right. The nature of the category has a big bearing on exactly how you approach this problem.
Can I make one comment? First of all, Deepa, I learned something new, which I knew internally but never sort of internalized. There's a difference, you know it, but you don't. And that was the part of emotion, what good design does for emotion. And this also addresses the question of what you think of the one upcoming brand. In my gut feeling, I could be wrong, but I feel Tesla is going to be a brand. Mm-hmm. And why I speak about it is when I first saw the Tesla in its Cupertino showroom by sheer fluke, I just loved it. I've never felt like this about a car. And it was something that appealed to the engineer in me. And the great part was that all the salespeople were engineers. For once I could ask technical questions and I got answers right away.
Probably all the people Samsung rejected just.
Or Apple rejects or whatever. And they were all like, so when I sat in the car and I saw what it could do for me, I was hooked. I'm proud to say I personally sold 2 Tesla cars. One to my dentist. For 6 months after him, to get one you like it. One to my financial advisor. Okay. And I've done many demonstrations of my Tesla car right on the beach, anywhere, anybody. Because I feel, and I hadn't realized what it was, but today I realized it's really the emotion, what it generates. And it really, and I read everything on that young man, Elon Musk now. I'm his biggest admirer. I'm really loves, of course.
I mean, I think nobody probably understands this more than, a room full of immigrants. If you look at how many people came to this country without having ever seen it or knowing anyone who was here, and what made you feel confident about that choice, interaction with movies, interaction with American fashion, American food and beverage. So you have this sense that there's opportunity, you have no idea, you don't know anybody, and you're willing to take that risk. I think at the very high end, that's how powerful narratives can be. And you have no direct experience, but to be able to say, I'm going to pack my bag and take a risk, I think it's no accident that America has still 57 of the world's most powerful brands, because you've understood how to tell an inclusive story for probably longer than anyone else.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Deepa for an excellent talk. Thank you. It was very